Hello, 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 and welcome. Welcome to this episode of the podcast. The title is The Lost Girls of Autism. And what I think is possibly puzzling for a couple of people is that you may have seen me do this yesterday. And you may have seen or heard a couple of technical issues. So if you were around yesterday, thank you very much, because I think it was quite a length of time that I was delving into this particular area. However, there were some technical issues. The first technical issue was that I couldn't really tell whether I was live or not. And so I stopped because I was just worried that I was perhaps missing some questions, comments, etc. And also there's not really that much point in talking for a length of time when, albeit there might not be anyone watching it live, some people will watch the recording. So that was the first issue. Then the second one was when I played it back, some of the graphics were in the wrong place. And also, and I hope I've solved this, when I played a couple of video clips, they had a heck of an echo on them. And I'm not quite sure why that is. I've checked it here and it shouldn't happen this time round. I've taken some different routes to get the audio and, mainly the audio to you. The visual part of it remains the same. But anyway, welcome. What's new then? Well, a lot really is happening in terms of our understanding of autism. And that's what I hope to talk about here. To begin, let me introduce you to this particular idea. In fact, where I've literally borrowed the title from, and I will pull up some, I hope, graphics for you, which you should see in just a second. And this time, I think they fit in the screen. So there's the first win. You see there, The Lost Girls of Autism. Now, I'm going to talk about the work of Gina Rippon, which I think is absolutely fascinating and incredibly important. And in fact, I will play you a couple of clips of Gina talking about her work, her ideas. The clips, obviously, the name implies, clips are not the full interview. It's an interview, I think it was conducted by the New Scientist group magazine publication. And I think if you are interested in what you are listening to here at the end of the podcast, then that's a good starting point. And there are also articles and things that you can read up on. For us right now, I thought what we should do is, rather than delve straight into what Gina has been researching and is talking about and is championing, we should take a step back and just consider what autism is. And what I've done is put together some little slides based on research that is out there, a couple of thoughts of mine, but essentially what exists now and also importantly has existed in the past, because we need to understand why Gina asserts, I think correctly by the way, that, well, the system has failed females. So let's begin then by talking about autism. What is autism? So autism spectrum disorder is a or autistic sometimes spectrum disorder is a neurodevelopmental condition characterized by differences in social communication, sensory processing and behavior. It's called a spectrum because symptoms vary widely in type and intensity. Some autistic individuals may need significant support while others live independently. And that word spectrum is really important here. It's important in many areas of life and indeed nature. So when we get into stereotypes, and I'll mention a couple, then whilst it can be illuminating and enlightening and draw attention, and that's all good, we constantly have to remind ourselves that everyone is unique, everyone is different, and one size doesn't fit all, which is kind of a theme for this episode. Core traits include challenges with social interactions like understanding non-verbal cues, repetitive behaviours, intense interests, and sometimes sensory sensitivities like being overwhelmed by loud noises. Autism is typically diagnosed in childhood, but many adults, especially females, are diagnosed later due to subtler symptoms, and that late diagnosis is something that we're seeing more and more and more. And whilst in one sense that is a shame, to say the least, because some people, they're fine, but others wish they had known earlier. So whilst it's good that they are being diagnosed, there is an overhaul which is required, it seems to me. And also I think that would probably chime with what Gina suggests. I said suggests. Research suggests autism has a strong genetic basis, with environmental factors playing a smaller role. According to the CDC, Centre for Disease Control, 1 in about 36 children in the US is diagnosed with autism, and it's lifelong, but manageable with support. So autism does seem to have a strong genetic basis. It does. There's something that, when you look at the heritability of it, when you look at what is different in some people with autism, there are clues which point to a genetic basis, like a lot of stuff. Environmental factors, a smaller role, yes, but maybe not as small as we think. And again, we will come on to that. So, how does female and male autism differ? Autism can look different depending on gender, which often affects diagnosis rates. Absolutely, it does. Again, I'm flagging some stuff up that we'll come back to. Historically, autism has been studied more in males, leading to a diagnostic bias. Males are diagnosed at a ratio of about 4:1 compared to females, but this gap is narrowing as we learn more. In other words, well, in fact, if we go back a little bit in time, it was considered not that long ago that if someone acted in a certain way and they were male, they were much more likely to be given a diagnosis of autism. If a female did the same thing, it was unlikely she'd be given that diagnosis, and therefore didn't receive the help, the attention, the understanding that she maybe should have had if that diagnosis, had it been given, was accurate. In males, again, these are generalizations I come back to. A reminder, it's a spectrum. We're not talking about individuals. We're talking about broad averages. And to use that word again, generalizations, it's very important to, I think, keep on reminding ourselves about that. In males, autism often presents with more noticeable traits. Think repetitive behaviours like hand flapping or intense focus on specific topics like trains or numbers. Again, some people get really focused on numbers. It becomes an obsession, a passion. There is this concept that train spotters tend to be male, and I think anecdotally that seems to be the case. Does that mean the people who are train spotters are autistic? No. But some intense focuses like trains, like numbers, like the numbers on trains, can be a sign that something is there that underpins it. But once more, I'm not a fan of labeling people. I think everyone should be allowed to be who they are. We're all different. And the only reason that I can think of that it is important to understand. Maybe we find ourselves in a category, in a diagnostic category, is to get help, is to gain understanding of ourselves and for other people to understand. Males may also struggle more visibly with social norms, sometimes appearing aloof or having meltdowns when routines change. And certainly I've seen that. I've seen that up close, and I've seen that in terms of clinical videos. So yes, that's definitely a thing. Females, on the other hand, on average, show subtler signs. They might have intense interests too, but these are often socially acceptable, like books or animals, making them less obvious. Now, again, some people say socially acceptable. I just think that they're probably more socially numerous. In other words, a lot of people do it. Less people go and do train spotting. Again, probably a bad example, but hopefully you get the point. So when it says acceptable, I don't think it means that, oh, well, you read a book, so I accept that. It's just a lot of people do. So it doesn't stand out as much. Females may also mimic social behaviours to fit in, which we'll dive into next. So that was a reminder for me in an earlier version. I've just kept it in because we will dive into it very shortly, but not quite right now. They're more likely to internalise struggles leading to anxiety or depression rather than external behaviours like aggression. And again, that seems to be the case. Why? Well, we'll eventually get there. Why the difference? Research points to a mix of biology and socialization. The female protective effect theory suggests females may need more genetic mutations to show autistic traits. In other words, males are in that sense more vulnerable. Not too many mutations will cause the males to manifest these symptoms. But with females, one could argue with a more robust system, perhaps, one way to describe it, certainly a different system according to this theory, then the odds are less that these physical signifiers of autism will show up in the same way that they would in males, meaning the symptoms are often milder. Social expectations also play a role. Girls are often socialized to be more emotionally attuned, which can mask autistic traits. And this is a core issue, or thread, in fact, within what I'm talking about here today. So they're socialized to be more emotionally attuned. Are they? Is that the case? Is it the case all the time? Can you be socialized to be more emotionally attuned? And can that mask autistic traits? Well, let's see what you think as we go along. How do females mask, and why are they able to do this? Masking or camouflaging is when autistic individuals hide their symptoms to blend in. Well, both males and females can mask, so again, it's not just females. Females tend to do it, averages again, more effectively, often delaying diagnosis until adulthood. And that doesn't mean to say that they're delaying it. It means that the diagnosis is not, well, it's not available to them because they're so good at disguising until adulthood. Now, part of that can be because of puberty and a different social setting and with different groups. And so some of the strategies might not be as effective, but they can be. And so there are many females, it is suggested, who have never received a diagnosis and may not be aware at all, beyond perhaps that, yeah, they do things differently, but so what? And in many ways, so what? That is if they are okay and they do not need help and support, in which case we need to have at least the ability to understand or allow them to understand what is going on. So I'm always caught with this because I don't like the labeling, as I say, but I also think it is important if people are struggling or wonder what is going on, that they have access to a proper understanding and help if required. And also, I think maybe people just accept things and life is tough, but they just say it's just the way I am. Although it is just the way they are, but a bit of understanding, a bit of help, a bit of support can make all the difference. So how do females mask? They might study and mimic social behaviours like maintaining eye contact or scripting conversations. And so some autistic females will literally write out scripts. Okay, what I'm going to do when I go to that place and I'm in that situation is I will do this. And when I do that, then somebody is likely to say this. And when they say this, I will say this other thing, and so on. So you can imagine that there's a huge amount of effort and energy that goes into this. And even like making eye contact, for some people, making eye contact it's not ideal. They don't really want to be doing that. And yet, some of these autistic females and males, again, averages, will maintain eye contact when it is uncomfortable. So I just think that it's so important that we tease this stuff out and people are allowed to be themselves and people are also able to access the help that they need. And to be given the help, they need to have the right understanding of what it is, the diagnosis in essence. Also, in terms of females, they may suppress stimming. Is that not a word? I'm not I'm not a fan of that word. It's not one of my favourite words. Anyway, stimming, as it's called, like rocking or fidgeting in public, or choose interests that align with peers to avoid standing out, pretending, feigning. But like, if you've ever met some guys who love cars, and I like cars, but I'm no petrol head, or is it battery head these days? And I'll talk about, wow, it's a 3.7. And I go, yeah, I kind of think I understand the engine, the stats, but interesting. But so sometimes you've got to appear more interested. And of course, for people who may be bewildered by a lot of the other interests that are around them, they find it that they can't really intuitively, naturally, emotionally connect, because their interests may be so narrow and so unique and so different that a lot of the time they're feigning. And gosh, once more, how difficult must that be? How labour intensive must that be, just emotionally, and also in terms of the executive suite in the brain, to think all that through. And as it says there, it's exhausting and can lead to burnout, unsurprisingly. Anxiety, unsurprisingly. And even a sense of losing one's identity, because if you think about it, if you're consistently pretending, then who are you? If I consistently pretended to be, again, I'm not disinterested in cars, but overly interested in cars, or overly interested in horse riding. I like horses. I think I've ridden one once, or was it a donkey? But I'm not overly interested in that whole area. Or polo, perhaps that's a better one. Never played that in my life. No intentions of playing it. But maybe if I was feigning that and feigning the engine thing, then again, who am I? Because where's what I want to do? Where are my core needs, interests, beliefs, values being met? Oh, they're not. So exactly who is this person? You can see how that could happen relatively quickly. Because remember, this is immersive. This is not just people dipping in and out. This can form a huge amount of the waking time, and probably dreaming time as well. So let's nip into this little paper here, the extreme male brain theory of autism, because this is part of the history and why for so long females who displayed kind of obviously autistic traits were missed. This is part of the reason. Not, by the way, this particular paper, or indeed this author, who's a very smart guy, Simon Baron-Cohen. Sacha Baron Cohen, a relation? Yes, he is. But this isn't Sacha. This is Simon. Very smart guy. And essentially he has a way of, or had a way of looking at autism. I think he still does. So the female brain, again from this paper, what is the evidence for female superiority in empathising? And the studies summarised here, sex differences of a small but statistically significant magnitude have been found. In other words, he's saying that the so-called female brain, and again, I'll give you a brief overview of that, very brief, because we've got some more recent research to listen and watch through. It is suggested that the female brain, whatever that means, is better at empathizing. The male brain may be, or may have a tendency towards systematizing. And again, this is the theory. The relevant domains in which to look for evidence include any that are in principle rule governed. Thus, chess and football are good examples of systems. Faces and conversations are not. Systemizing involves monitoring three things in order: input, operation, and output. The operation is what you did to the input or what happened to the input to produce the output. Again, even that sounds very systematic. So this would be like engines. It would be shapes that are rotating. It wouldn't be faces. It wouldn't be conversations. It wouldn't be emotional connection. It would be objects. It would be numbers. And basically, and by the way, I put some references in. You can always freeze that at any point. There's some other references, I think, as well, if you're interested in diving more deeply. But I'll finish this part. Sadly, masking can make it harder for females to get diagnosed and access support. But awareness is growing and more clinicians are recognising those subtle signs, which is good, is fab. But this systemizing issue, the extreme male brain theory, so Simon Baron-Cohen, again, clever guy, not saying this has to be the case, but he's looking at one way to think about autism. And the idea, essentially, the empathizing and the systemizing type brain, he was suggesting is to do with testosterone and exposure to it in the fetus. And so this can shape some areas of brain development. And you kind of sort of intuitively, I believe, think, okay, that probably does have some sort of effect. And his suggestion is that it would lead to a more systemizing approach, more about objects and numbers and inputs and outputs, rather than this concept of empathy and faces and conversations. So interests and attunement to the emotional side of and the feeling side of our lives, as opposed to not as much about that. It's not as if there aren't emotions, but it's more about these objects and numbers, etc. And because testosterone theoretically should be more in the male population, and therefore when there is an increased level above a certain point in the fetus that could cause these developmental changes to that extent, then we would see more males who were autistic. And that indeed is what we do see when we look at them one way. And it is also what we see when we believe that females couldn't be acting that way because of autism. So it's quite nuanced and slightly complex, this area. And so that's why I bring that up, because when we then listen to what Gina's going to talk about, Gina Rippon, then you can see how she sort of said, okay, but what are we missing here? So what will we do next? So flick through these slides again, just so we get to this. So this is by Gina from The New Scientist. And again, we'll listen tour. I'm going to play a couple of those clips from an interview in a little while. By studying the brains of autistic girls, we now know the condition presents differently in them than in boys, suggesting that huge numbers of women have gone undiagnosed. So in other words, we're picking up all the males, well, not all, but a lot of them, and therefore we've got this ratio which suggests that there are many, many more autistic males and females, but huge numbers, it is suggested, of females have gone undiagnosed. In China, it is known as the lonely disease. And that is sad, isn't it? That is poetic and sad. The Japanese term translates as intentionally shut. It's a little bit more stark. I think, is it intentionally? Across the world, there is a perception of autistic people as aloof, socially awkward and isolated, seeming to not only lack the kind of automatic social instinct that enables successful interaction, but also the desire to achieve it. There is also a perception that autistic people tend to be men. Again, we've covered that already. For decades, researchers, myself included, not me, that's Gina, have thought of autism as a predominantly male condition. The more we studied boys and men, the clearer the picture of autism that emerged, or so we thought. And to me, it's sort of an example of like a self-fulfilling prophecy, what has gone on for a while. And then if we move on with that article, today we have come to realise that we were missing a huge piece of the puzzle all along. Not only have we been failing to recognise autism in vast numbers of women and girls, preventing them from getting a diagnosis and support, but we have now made the profound discovery that the female autistic brain works differently than the male one, especially when it comes to social motivations and behaviours. As a result, an entirely new picture of autism in girls is crystallising, forcing a radical rethink of everything we thought we knew. We have now made the profound discovery that the female autistic brain works differently than the male one. And I'm not surprised by that. I'm not surprised. I mean, it's fascinating, but I'm just kind of resonates as yes, of course, to me anyway. So, what shall we do? I think we should have a listen and a watch. Part of the interview with Gina. Let's hear what she's got to say in this part.
So when we did that on males, as you say, what did we find out about the brain?
Well, it was interesting because the discovery of different networks in the brain which underpin social behaviour tied in with an idea that our brains have actually evolved, yes, to give us language and creativity, etc., but also to make us social, make sure we're social, but also had to have a drive to be social. So it wasn't just a sort of pattern of behaviour, it was something we needed to do. And part of the so-called social brain is a reward system, which, this was a good thing, make sure you do that again, and perhaps not a good idea to go through that again, do a U-turn if necessary kind of thing. And one of the areas I'd worked in was like negative social experiences. So some of us social cognitive neurosciences are real killjoys because you put people in a scanner and make themselves feel bad about themselves, or imagine a situation where they created, it was a real faux pas, or to take part in a video game where they're consistently rejected by the other players, etc. So then you could see the different patterns of behavior within the social brain. And what was starting to emerge in the early work with autism was that there was an underactivity, less responsivity to negative social experiences in the autistic participants than in the neurotypical participants. And so we started to evolve this model about the hypoactive social brain, an underactive reward system, getting less, enjoyment from social experiences, less motivated to be social.
And presumably less of that negative feedback, so you don't mind so much if you are rejected if you don't fit in.
It's a sort of shrug, like.
Okay, so a hypoactive social brain, a reward system which wasn't rewarding. And I think that whole idea about the social brain is worth just pausing for a second to consider why that's important. It's important to people because it would be extremely difficult to survive. These days it's extremely difficult to survive on our own. We generally need to be networked and interconnected with so many different people with so many different professions. But go back in time when we were in tribes. If we weren't in those tribes, then how could we possibly defend ourselves in certain environments? Because humans aren't, they're not very fast compared to a lot of animals. Teeth and claws are pretty useless, not that strong, not compared to a bear, etc. And so being social is part of survival. And so the brain is going to have these areas which will tend to promote being social, will tend to cause us to want to connect with people. And if something goes wrong, to feel, oh gosh, that was a bit painful, I don't want that to happen again. And to feel that, right, I feel good because I am connected, and the reward system will reinforce that. But when you've got someone who they're not bothered, and they just don't connect in that same way, then you can see how the wiring and connectivity can be therefore different, and can therefore explain, at least in part with some people, what may be going on and why there isn't, or there is a different approach to socializing. It isn't as important. It doesn't matter as much. There isn't the reward there. And so what then? Well, let's then look at part 2 of Gina, the clip. Again, the interview is far longer. I encourage you to watch the whole thing if you're interested.
And that was the model that was emerging. And it was only when I started to look at all of the studies that had been done on the social brain, which is where it turned out that, as I said, 70% had only been done on males, and of the rest, there were a very small number of females, almost too few to do any comparisons anyway. But then there was also a kind of call to arms within the neuroscience community and saying we really ought to be looking at sex and gender differences. But when they started carrying out those kind of researches, even replicating earlier work done on the social brain with female participants, they found a very different pattern of activity. Female participants were much more likely to respond much more powerfully to negative social experiences, but also to show evidence of constant sort of self-referencing, self-monitoring throughout social, the kind of social tasks we'd put in the scanner. And you can interpret that as saying, well, they mind very much. There has been this long-standing belief that females are more driven to network with other individuals, to be social. And so there is a suggestion, and there was a suggestion early on, that the reason girls were being missed because they were socialized from a very early age to behave themselves, to be nice, to be quiet, not to make a fuss. And so they were almost being trained to be camouflagers, because if they weren't camouflagers, then they were going to behave a lot more like the boys who are very external. The core problem is similar in that there is some difficulty with the means of social behavior for all of the members of the autistic population. But for the group that spend a lot of time camouflaging and hiding their autism, which if you think about it is a bit paradoxical. If you think being autistic is not not worrying about not being social, but the reason they camouflage is because they're so worried.
So, the females seemed to care. There was a feeling, a connection, an inherent knowing that, oh, when this didn't work socially, I'm picking up on something that I don't like. Again, we're talking in generalizations, whereas the males tended to not have that as an issue. It just wasn't registering, at least in the same way. And also this awareness, this reflection, this self-referential process that seems to be going on with the females, is that an indication of how indeed they are, well, one of the ways that they're able to change their behaviors, to mimic, to mask? Because if you think about it, we couldn't do that, could we? If we wanted to pretend that we were really interested in American football, and I'm getting converted, but if someone isn't, then to feign that, we'd have to look at how people were acting, how the facial expressions presented themselves, the language that they used. I mean, we need then to have to say, I'm not looking and acting and sounding like that, therefore I need to adjust in this way to match and mirror what is going on. Whereas you don't see that, certainly in a percentage of males on the autistic spectrum. It isn't there. It is, of course, with some, because again, it is a spectrum. But with females, on average, this seems to be because of the masking and the scripting of things. There seems to be an indication that this could be one of the ways that they're doing it. And I'm paraphrasing when I'm interpreting what Gina has said there. So what I want to do now is to begin, as we head towards finishing up, I'd like to take us back, if we can, to our little canter through the what's been written about it. Again, this is from Gina. So we're continuing, and this is a text from an interview. We're continuing to learn from Gina what her thinking is, and what her approach has been, and also, in my opinion, why this is important. So, why can we see more camouflaging in females than males, and is it related to gender socialization? That's already been touched upon, but this is a direct question, and as Gina says, the $1 million question. Absolutely. I mean, it really is. It is definitely the case that autistic camouflaging appears to be more common in females. How much is this related to gendered socialization? And good question. Certainly, the female autism lived experience literature wholeheartely supports this. Now, I should say, just in case that term's perhaps new to you, lived experience. I mean, some people call that tautology. I'm not one of them, actually, but I can see why. It's sometimes this might be considered to be phenomenology in terms of research, and I've done a reasonable amount of reading and even research in the area of lived experiences, and so I think it's extremely valid. Essentially, it is what it says. My thoughts on what was happening to me and how it felt are these. So this is important. So the female autism lived experience literature wholeheartedly supports this. For example, in Joanne Lindbergh's book, Letters to My Weird Sisters, she observes, many of the moments when my autism caused problems, or at least marked me out as different, were those moments when I had come up against some unspoken law about how a girl or woman should be and failed to meet it. An unspoken law. Isn't that interesting? And the psychiatric literature on the internalizing of mental health issues in females suggests that gendered socialization has a powerful role to play in the muffling or minimizing of internal distress, as do wider discussions on the role of what I call the born to be mild directives in girls' upbringing, with much greater emphasis on fitting in, belonging, or not drawing attention to yourself, for example. Whether what we see in autistic females is just a reflection of the consequences of gendered socialization for all females, or whether their autism makes them more susceptible to such pressures, will be a very interesting research question for the future. Absolutely. Totally. And more power to her, because I think this is so important. It, as I've said already, understanding ourselves, understanding each other, understanding what support and help people may need, because we're all different, is crucial. It's essential. And so, I go back to this little part though, on the role of what I call the born to be mild directives in girls' upbringing. Is that true though, across the board? I mean, it's a generalization, and I know Gina will know that, and it is important to question it. But I wonder if things have evolved a little bit. I wonder. I don't think that is the case as much these days. But then that would be my observation. And so therefore it's anecdotal. We need to look at bigger populations to find out what is actually going on, for that to be statistically powered enough for us to pay attention to. So I'm sort of countering the lived experience idea, which I believe is important, but we need to get more of an understanding. And this part, whether what we see in autistic females is just a reflection of the consequences of gendered socialization for all females, or whether their autism makes them more susceptible to such pressures. See, I would add in something else there, Gina. Or whether their autism makes them more, or whether the fact that their version of autism makes them not more susceptible, it makes them more tuned in to wanting to fit in. And yes, of course, we have the other dimension of, be mild. But if that wasn't there, if that was sort of neutral, be who you want, could it be that they're, unlike the males, some males, again, averages, who're saying, well, I want to count these numbers, and you might be upset, but I'm not even picking that up. I don't have the radar to be able to understand what that signal is that you're sending out with that facial expression. So that's not there. With the females, could it be that with this functioning and connectivity being in some way, it would seem different on average? Could it be that therefore there's something in there that is empathic, that has that inbuilt desire to fit in, unlike some of the males, because they're looking at the systems as opposed to the faces and the conversations. And Gina Rippon's a very smart individual, and this is great work, and probably it's implicit in what she's saying. But I think it's important that that's teased out, because that would really help us understand much more about what is going on. And also to look back to Simon Baron-Cohen's work about the extreme male theory, then maybe there's an extreme female theory that we need to understand. How would that manifest? What would be the etiology of that? Anyway, let me. I think that was the the last slide. So hopefully you've found that interesting. I hope the sound and vision has been okay. I hope we haven't had any particular issues. No doubt there'll be the odd thing that if this is recorded, I'll have a look at it and check it out and adjust as we go along. If you're watching this live and have tuned in, thank you very much. I really do appreciate it. If you have just happened upon the channel and are thinking of subscribing, please do. It does make a big difference. We're not too far away from hitting a magic number, which allows me to do much more on this particular platform. If you are watching the recording, then yes, again, thanks for watching. If you subscribe, thanks for subscribing. If you're thinking of subscribing, please do. It does make a big difference. Can't see any questions. I hope I'm not missing any. If there are, I will pick up on them, and of course comments as well. And I tend to, wherever possible, sometimes I miss them for whatever reason, but wherever possible, I will reply. I will help in any way that I can to make clearer, if it's not clear, what I've been talking about. So, for the moment, from me, you might hear me say goodbye a couple of times as I begin to shut down bits and pieces. But the moment from me, bye for now.